Hey everyone, I'm Kate Kennedy and I'm here with day 5 of 100 Days of Kane, PA. And today we're going to talk to someone that most of you know, and if you know her, you know you love her, Mrs. Espin. I remember Mrs. Espin as a secretary at the high school, and just seeing her is like a warm hug. She's always so friendly and kind and loving, and she has a really great story to share with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and flip you around. We're going to walk right in. Hello, Mrs. Espin.
Hi.
Thank you so much for having us here today.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. Thank you for coming.
It's always so great to see you. You just have such a great presence, and you make everyone feel safe and loved and warm. And so I'm so happy that we're going to spend time with you today.
Well, I'm really happy to have you here, Katie.
And I know that you know a lot of people in town through a lot of different ways, but the way that I know you, and I think many people do, is when you were working at the high school.
That's right.
How many years were you with the school district?
Well, I just looked it up this morning, and considering when I first started there for 2 hours a day, I was there almost 30 years.
Almost 30 years. So almost 30 years worth of students got to experience you.
Right. But I started work. I was a secretary to the principal at the high school probably for 15 or 20 years.
Wow. So who were the superintendents under your time at the school?
Mr. Johnson was the principal, superintendent, and Jack Hedlund was the principal.
Well, you were such an asset, definitely, and I know that you made so many kids' days. And one of the things that we are going to talk about today is you're from Kane, right?
Yes.
Born and raised.
Right.
You went to Kane High School.
Yes.
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1949.
That's awesome. So you've been around for a while to know why Kane is so special. And I was curious, when we were talking earlier today, how did your family end up in Kane?
Well, I'm going to preface this by that I have been thinking since I talked to you. I wanted to think about who a hero was to me, and I didn't have to go far. But it was my mother. My mother was a very, very much a hero to me because she left. She was born and raised in Italy. And she came to the United States when she was 21 years old. She lived in a very small hamlet in Italy and had never been away from this little community she was in. And they had decided to send her to come to the United States. And what she went through, I don't think I could have done it. I have to say a novena before I make a trip to Warren. And she was coming all the way from Italy, and she started out on a train station, and someplace in Naples, she got lost, and she was lost for a day and a half before somebody helped her get on the right train, and then she went on to where the ship was, and My mother was interviewed, and I thought this would be very much interest of you. She let's see, she was born Rosa Monturo on November 16th, 1897, and let's see now. She left her home on January 29th. And boarded the ship King of Italy was the name of the ship on January the 31st, 1921. Her mother supplied her with food for the trip as she was traveling third class, and the food was very bad. The ship was overcrowded. They were not in individual rooms, but had about 100 people jammed in one room with triple bunk beds. It was not your typical love boat cruise. She was very glad to sight the Statue of Liberty. The ship arrived at Ellis Island on February 15th and was quarantined for 2 weeks. Her brother would row out to the ship in a canoe and have food brought up to her by ropes to her. Well,
I can imagine. So she just traveled from Italy to the United States of America, and they kept her on the boat for 2 weeks?
Right.
And what was the purpose of that?
They were quarantined. They had to make sure that there was no diseases. If they were there legitimately, that they weren't trying to get in there with for other bad reasons.
And her brother, who was already in Kane, had made the trip to New York to bring food to her while she was quarantined on the ship.
Right, right. And his name was John Monturo, and he had made arrangements for her to come to the United States. And she had, when he wrote and told her that he was sending money for her, she did not realize exactly why he was doing it. She assumed, because her only knowledge of the United States was that people went there and went to en route to work in factories. So she assumed that that's what she was doing. In reality, my uncle was fixing up a marriage with her and a friend of his, and the man had gave him the money for her to come over. And my father was a friend of my uncle, and when he saw a picture of my mother, and he said, that guy's not going to marry her, I'm going to marry her. He was so taken by her picture. And he said, I'll give you the money to give it back to him. And so that's how my mother got over. But I just read this and I didn't realize, I don't think she knew that was why. She thought she was coming to work in a factory. And when she came over, she stayed with my uncle and my aunt for several months. And then my dad must have courted her, and I think they arrived in the end of February, the beginning of February, when she landed there, and I think September of that year, my dad married her.
Wow. So she came from Italy to Ellis Island, from Ellis Island by boat.
Right.
From Ellis Island to Kane by train, I'm guessing?
She came by train.
And then she met your father, and they courted shortly and then got married.
I asked her, I said, well, what did you find, when did you think when they told you were going to be marrying somebody that you didn't know? And she said, I didn't know either one of them, so it didn't make any difference. Because that's what they did. They arranged marriages like that. It was very common, except that I don't think she knew it. So she was a hero because she went along with it.
That takes courage.
Yes, it did.
So where did your parents live when they first got married?
Well, they lived with my aunt and uncle for several months, and then they moved to an apartment over on Dawson Street, and they lived in an apartment upstairs, and the downstairs was a store. I can't remember the man's name, but when my mother would go downstairs, she couldn't speak English at all, and she would look at things, and he would come over and he'd say, do you need milk? And he'd hold up a cup of milk or a bottle of milk or bread, and she would look at the bread and she'd say Banu, and he would say this is bread in English, bread. And she said that was the first time she learned any English, because this man very kindly told her, and that she would do that every time she would come downstairs. He would show her something else and tell her what it was, and she would tell him what it was in Italy, what it was in Italian. And that was her first contact with someone that was not in the family.
Yeah.
And they lived there for several months, and then they decided to try and buy a house. And my father, they didn't have very much money, and so he went to a man uptown that owned a furniture store. His name was Mr. Dolan. And I'm not quite sure why he did this, but he went over to him and asked him if he would lend him money to buy this house. And Mr. Dolan asked him a few questions, and he said, yes, I will finance you that. And you can pay me because he had a job at the railroad, and he said, you pay me when you can. So my dad would take him 25 or 50 cents a month, to pay off the house. And that was the house that they went over on Elk Street. And they lived there until my father died. And that was many, many years. And when they were there for... I think it was I thought today it was earlier than that, but it was, let me tell you. they had moved into their house in 1924, and they were only there for 2 weeks. And a tornado, the first tornado in Kane, hit, and it took the roof right off the house.
Oh my gosh!
And she said it was one of the most scary things that she's ever had experienced. She didn't even know what that was. She didn't know what tornado meant.
Right.
Kane didn't either. That was the first one they ever had.
Right.
And she said that my father was very depressed about that. He said, what are we going to do? Now we own for that, and now we have to get a roof. So he went up to Mr. Dolan, and he said, you're going to have to take the house back because we can't afford to put a roof on. And Mr. Dolan said, Mr. Kalala, I will give you money to get a roof on your house, and you can just pay me like you do for the house. And that was, I thought, one of the nicest things I ever heard. Back in that day, I'm really surprised that happened. And my father and mother were just astonished that somebody that he didn't even know them. But that was their first experience with Kane.
Wow.
So you could see why they just loved Kane.
Yes.
And that's how they ended up there, and they both lived there. As I said, when he died there, but my mother was there. She lived to be 103, and she was at the nursing home, the Lutheran nursing home, when she died. She'd been there for about a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a special story. That Mr. Dolan, what a great man. So kind to help finance the house, and then when the tornado took the roof off, to help pay for that and just let your family pay it back as they could.
Yes, and my mom said that because they started to have kids, they had 10 children, and she said they didn't always have money each month, but he would never ask them for it. He said he knew that he was good for it, and my father was very, very, very happy about that.
Yeah, what a kind man, and yeah, that's just a really special story. And I'm wondering, you said your dad worked at the railroad?
He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and I think he worked there for over 30 years.
And is there any special stories you have about him at the railroad?
Well, when he went to work there, his real name was Sebastian Fiorentino Kalala. And but the men there couldn't say that name. They didn't know how to say that. And they gave him a nickname, and they called him Friday. And one of the reasons was because my mother would give him a bucket lunch every day, and they didn't have sandwiches back then, and so she would put bread in there, but she would cook something. And if there was anything left over, the guys would say, well, we're going to ask Friday if he could give us some of his bucket. So, and he loved that job. He worked right here in Kane for many, many years. He climbed the tipple when they put water in the trains, and he would work the turntable when the train had to be turned around, and he really liked it. And when that closed down, he hitchhiked to Ridgeway to work on the railroad, and he would work 2 shifts a day. And he either did that because they needed the money, or he couldn't wait to get out of the house with 12 people in it.
Well, what great parents. I mean, your father so hardworking and dedicated to the family, and your mother with so much courage to make that trip over by herself and to just make this really nice life for you and for your father and for your family. So
they sacrificed a lot for us, and we all know that, and we've always known that. And my mother only went to 3rd grade because in Italy, she went to 3rd grade, and after 3rd grade, you had to pay to go to get an education. And so when she came to the United States, she taught herself how to read English and how to write it. And she had most of the Italians that lived around the West Side would come to her when they would get a letter from Italy, so she could translate it because they couldn't read Italian, most of the people. And so she could read both. And so she did that for many, many years.
What a special person.
Yes, she was. She was.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your family?
No, I think they were wonderful parents. The one thing that I can remember besides Mr. Dolan was that when somebody explained to them what voting was, they both registered as Democrats, because by that time, Mr. Roosevelt was in it. Franklin Roosevelt, and they thought the world of him. And my father sometimes had to miss it because he worked 2 shifts on the railroad, but she would make sure that she would always go to vote, and she embedded that in us, because she would say, it's the most important thing you do, because when we lived in Italy, they did not have a democracy. And she said, you should be very happy. What we have here in the United States, we will never think anything but wonderful about it. And to the day she died, she voted every year. Sometimes by she would write it in absentee ballot. And I'll have to share this to you too. But the first job I ever had was a state job. I worked for the state unemployment compensation, and that was whoever was in politically was my boss, and my boss was a Republican, and I was only 18 when I started to work there after school, and when I turned 21, I was told that I should register to vote, and I said, yes, I know, my mother already told me that. So they said, well, you have to make sure that you register as a Republican. And I said, well, I can't do that because I'm a Democrat. And they said, well, you have to do it because now the Republicans are in, and that's who you should do that. Well, I didn't know any better, so I went home and I told him. My father was really upset, but he said that he couldn't go 1 year because he was working, couldn't vote. So he had to re-register, and he sacrificed, because this was a sacrifice to my father. He said, I will register as a Republican because I don't want you to lose your job. Aww. I said, I don't think that you're going to lose your job. It's only me. And he says, no, I don't want to. I want to make sure. And so he did. He registered as a Republican, and to the day he died, he was a Republican. But he was a Democrat in his heart.
He was such a supportive father of you.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Sounds like such a great man, such a great woman. And I'm not surprised knowing you, because you are such a wonderful asset to Kane. You've given love and support and encouragement to so many people, but especially so many kids in high school, which can sometimes be hard for people. And you are always kind. And I can see, just hearing your stories, where that comes from.
Well, that was the biggest thing my mother taught all of us. Our faith was very, very much a part of our growing up, and but she lived it, and she said to be kind. She did a lot with all that she had on her plate. She was always so kind to other people that were in need, because back then there were a lot of people that were in need. I mean, this was through the Depression, and they had a big garden, and my mother would have my father take a lot of the food to people that didn't have a garden. So she told us that we had to be kind or else.
Well, it works for you.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to share?
No, only that I've been blessed in living here in Kane, and my children it was a blessing for them to be in Kane, because they had a wonderful growing up where we lived over on Park Avenue, and I just think I've been very blessed with living here in Kane, and I still love it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and we just really appreciate your time and your heart and who you are, Mrs. Espin.
Thank you for asking.
All right, everyone, there you have it, day 5. Those stories were very moving to me. I know you're not surprised at what wonderful parents Mrs. Espin had, because she's such a wonderful lady. And I hope that this was something that you really got to enjoy. And I would ask you, what brought you to Kane? Maybe you were born here, lived here your whole life, and you're still here. Or maybe you came from somewhere else and moved here, and now you love Kane too. So in the comments, share what brought you to Kane. We'd love to hear your story too. All right, everyone, tune in tomorrow for day 6.